Okay, let's actually start with a sound today. I want you to close your eyes for a second.
Always a good way to start.
Right. So in your head, imagine the loudest, most absolute bone-rattling crack of a thunderbolt you have ever heard.
Oh, yeah. That really visceral, sky-tearing crash.
Exactly. Now, transport yourself back, say, 5,000 years. You are a human sitting in a cave, you're huddled in the dark, maybe wearing furs, and you hear that sound. To you, that isn't just weather. It isn't, a low-pressure system colliding with a high-pressure system. It is a
It's a
voice.
divine temper tantrum.
Yes.
But
It's Zeus throwing a lightning bolt, or Thor hammering the sky. It is the sound of something terrifying and massive and completely unexplained. It's the sound of the unknown demanding a sacrifice.
because fear is the mother of that kind of faith.
But now, fast forward to right now. You are sitting in a temperature-controlled room. You are commuting in a car that runs on electricity, which is the very thing that used to be the weapon of the gods. You are checking a weather app on a smartphone that has more computing power than the entire Apollo mission. You know that thunder isn't a god shouting. It is just the rapid expansion of air caused by electrical discharge.
We have the mechanics now. We know the how.
Right. We know that disease isn't a demon, it is a bacteria or a virus. We have mapped the human genome, we've charted the stars, we have largely demystified all those scary dark corners of the world. So here is the big, uncomfortable question we really need to wrestle with on this deep dive today. In this world of high-tech sovereignty, of Nordic secular metrics, of gene editing and AI, is religion just bloatware?
Bloatware. That is a very specific and I'll say very cynical metaphor.
It fits, though. I mean, when you buy a new computer and it comes preloaded with all this old, clunky software running in the background, it slows down the processor, it takes up memory, and you never actually use it. For a lot of modern people, that is exactly what religion feels like. Old code, legacy software. So is it time to just uninstall the program?
What you're describing there is the ignorance hypothesis.
The ignorance hypothesis.
Yeah, it is the standard narrative of modernity. The idea is basically that God lives in the gaps of our knowledge. When the gap was huge, like when we didn't know what lightning was, God was huge. But as knowledge grows, those gaps shrink. And as the gaps shrink, God shrinks. Eventually, the gaps close completely and God evaporates.
It's a really compelling narrative because it feels like progress. We used to need the crutch and now we can run.
It does feel that way. But I want to propose a counter signal today, a totally different way of reading the data. What if the code isn't obsolete? What if we have just been looking at the user interface all wrong?
Okay, I am listening. I'm going to be the skeptic here. I am stepping into the role of the empiricist today. I want data. I want logic. I do not want poetry about feelings.
And you shall have it. For this deep dive, we are pulling from the work of J.R. Ahmed, specifically looking at his analysis in his text, Why Atheists Say Leave Religion.
Great source.
But we aren't just listing complaints today. The mission is to actually stress test these arguments. We are going to take the biggest friction points, things like empiricism, morality, violence, women's rights, and we are going to see how the Quranic framework actually responds to them.
So it's a full-on stress test.
Exactly. We're trying to move from that idea of the God of the gaps to something Ahmed calls the symphony of systems.
The symphony of systems. That sounds really layered.
It is very layered. Imagine blending the rhythmic, biological ping of a heart monitor with the digital, high-tech pulse of a server room. That is the vibe we are going for.
All right, let's boot this up. Let's start where every debate starts. The origin story, or as I like to call it, Zeus versus the weatherman.
Let's get into it.
So the atheist critique here is foundational. It says religion was a survival mechanism. Early humans were terrified. They were small, the world was big and dangerous, they needed agency, they needed to believe someone was driving the bus, even if that someone was angry. So we invented gods to explain the scary thunder. It was primitive science, a coping mechanism.
Born in ignorance.
Exactly. And the argument follows that now that science explains how the rain falls, how the crops grow, how the sun burns, we really do not need the who. Faith is described in the source material as a fading, faulty gleam. It is a candlelight in a world that now has LEDs. Why cling to the candle when you have the floodlight of physics?
This is where it gets fascinating because the Quran actually anticipates this exact critique. It steps right into that arena. If you look at the text, the source code, if you will, it never claims to be a textbook on meteorology. It isn't trying to tell you the wind velocity of a storm. It is not trying to compete with your weather app.
But if it claims to be the truth, surely it has to address reality.
It addresses reality by completely reframing it. The Quran argues that discovering the mechanism doesn't negate the designer, it actually highlights the sophistication of the design. This is the core concept of ayat.
Define that for us. Ayat.
In Arabic, ayah means a sign. It is a pointer. The Quran isn't asking you to fear the thunder because it's a monster. It is asking you to study the system of the thunder as a sign of a higher order. Look at chapter 3, verses 190 and 191. It says, "Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and earth, and the alternation of night and day, are signs for those of understanding."
Those of understanding. That is a very specific phrase. It's not those of fear or those of blind faith.
Precisely. The text describes these people as those who give thought to the creation. It is an explicit invitation to analyze. The argument isn't, don't look behind the curtain. The argument is, look closely at how the curtain is woven. The source material points out that the Quran promises evidence will be found in two specific places. This is in chapter 41, verse 53. It says, "We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves."
The horizons and themselves. So you're talking about the macro and the micro.
Exactly. The external cosmos, so astrophysics, biology, geology, and the internal world of consciousness in human biology. The text argues that scientific discovery doesn't replace God. Every time we peel back a layer of the universe and find more complexity, more order, more fine-tuning, from the Quran's perspective, we aren't finding nature acting on its own. We are seeing the ayat of the sovereign intelligence.
Let me see if I can clarify the rationalist position here with an analogy. Let's say I walk into a fully automated smart home. The lights turn on when I enter, the temperature adjusts, the coffee starts brewing. The ignorance hypothesis guy walks in and says, wow, there must be a ghost doing this. Then he pokes around, he finds the motion sensor, he finds the thermostat, he reads the code, and he says, oh, there is no ghost. It is just sensors and wires.
And he thinks he has completely solved it.
Right. But the rationalist, the Quranic perspective says, wait a minute. The fact that there are sensors and wires and code that perfectly anticipate your needs, that proves there was an architect?
That is the absolute perfect analogy. The ignorance hypothesis assumes that once we see the code, the coder disappears. The Quranic framework argues that the code is the proof of the coder. It is a shift from looking for magic tricks like lightning bolts thrown by Zeus to looking at the system performance. It moves God from being an explanation for what we don't know to the explanation for why what we do know is so orderly.
It transforms the universe from a chaotic accident into a readable text.
Exactly. The universe is a book. Science is just the act of reading it.
Okay, that covers the cosmic stuff. It is a valid philosophical pivot, I will give you that, but let's bring it down to the ground level. Because for a lot of people, the reason they leave religion isn't just about astrophysics. It is about ethics. It is about how we treat each other.
The moral algorithm.
Right. The empiricist argument is pretty damning here. We do not need a holy book to be good people. We have evolution. We have mirror neurons.
Explain the mirror neurons for the listeners who might not be up on their neuroscience.
Sure. So mirror neurons are these amazing cells in our brains that fire when we act, but they also fire when we observe someone else acting. If I see you smash your thumb with a hammer, my brain lights up in the exact same pain centers, just a little less intense. I feel your pain, literally.
So empathy is hardware.
It is hardwired. And historically, if you killed your tribe members, you didn't survive. So we are good because it is evolutionarily advantageous. We are nice because it helps us pass on our genes.
The moral roots argument.
Yeah, we see this in the data. Look at the Nordic countries. Sweden, Norway, Denmark. They are some of the most secular places on earth. The churches are empty. But they have some of the highest happiness scores, lowest crime rates, and best social safety nets in the world. They aren't getting their morality from a pulpit. They are getting it from a secular social contract. Morality evolves. What was right 1,000 years ago, like slavery or feudalism, is wrong now. We are the architects of our own ethics. Why do we need an old book to tell us not to kill?
That is a very strong argument, and it appeals heavily to our sense of modern superiority. It feels really good to say we engineered our own goodness. But here is the rationalist counter, and it is what J.R. Ahmed calls the anchoring problem.
The anchoring problem.
If morality is just a social trend, or even just a biological impulse, it isn't fixed. It floats. It is like a boat without an anchor. It just drifts with whatever the current is. If we are the architects, we can redesign the building however we want.
Give me a concrete example of this drift.
Let's look at the early 20th century. Eugenics.
Oof. Very dark chapter.
Extremely dark. But we have to remember, and the source material stresses this, at the time, eugenics wasn't considered evil by the secular elite. It was considered scientific progress. It was supported by academics, by governments, by the Supreme Court in the U.S. It was considered rational to sterilize the quote-unquote unfit to improve the human herd.
Because it made biological sense in a very cold, calculated way.
Exactly. It was moral by the standards of the day because the goal was the improvement of the species. Now, obviously, we look back in horror. But here is the terrifying part. If morality is purely relative to the culture, you lose the ability to say that eugenics, or genocide, for that matter, is objectively wrong. You can only say it is currently unpopular.
Because if the majority decides tomorrow that we should go back to eugenics and there is no sovereign intelligence to say no, then eugenics becomes right again.
Precisely. If the social contract changes, the morality changes. There is no floor.
So you are saying we need an external hard drive for our morals, something that cannot be overwritten by the current user.
In a way, yes. The Quran introduces the concept of the fitra. Think of this as the factory settings.
Factory settings, I like that.
The idea is that humans do have a built-in moral compass. That empathy you mentioned, those mirror neurons, they are absolutely part of the design. But the compass needs an objective external standard to stay calibrated. Otherwise, the magnetic field of culture can just spin the needle. And the Quran uses a really powerful sonic analogy for what happens when we rely only on social contracts that can be broken.
Lay it on me.
Imagine the sound of a spinning thread. Something strong, woven tight, just being untwisted.
Like a sound, just unraveling. All that tension totally gone.
Yes. Chapter 16, verse 92 says, "Do not be like the one who untwisted her spun thread after it was strong." It is describing a society that builds a strong moral code, a tight thread, and then unravels it for political expediency or gain. It is warning that without an anchor, good is just a temporary agreement that can be untwisted whenever it gets inconvenient.
Untwisting the thread, that is a very vivid image of moral regression. It implies that you can build a civilized society like 1920s Germany, which was highly educated and highly cultured, and then dismantle it into barbarism just as fast if the foundation isn't solid.
And this leads to one of the most challenging aspects of the Quranic framework. It is something I call justice blindness.
Justice blindness.
Evolution teaches us tribalism. Care for your kin. Protect your group. That is biological. My genes must survive. I am wired to protect my children and my tribe over yours.
Right. Us versus them is baked right into the lizard brain.
But look at Quran chapter 5, verse 8. It commands something that goes completely against our biological grain. It says, "Stand firm for Allah, witnesses in justice, and do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just."
Do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. That is a massive ask.
It is entirely counter-evolutionary. It demands you uphold justice even against your own interests, against your own parents, or in favor of your worst enemy. You cannot get that from mirror neurons alone. Mirror neurons fire for people you identify with. They fire for us. They very often do not fire for them. The Quranic code says no. The standard of justice is absolute. It is sovereign. It sits outside your feelings.
So the argument is that while empathy is the engine, revelation is the steering wheel.
Precisely. Without the steering wheel, the engine of empathy can be driven straight off a cliff if the cultural map changes. If the culture decides that a certain group is not human, like the Jews in the 1930s or the Tutsi in Rwanda, empathy just turns off. We've seen that happen in history over and over. The Quranic code says no. The standard is anchored.
That is a stark difference. One is bottom up, the other is top down.
And the rationalist argues that you absolutely need the top-down anchor to protect the bottom-up empathy.
Let's pivot here. We have talked about origins and morality. Now I want to talk about performance.
System performance.
The data crunch. Because you can sit here and talk about theory and untwisted threads all day, but we live in the real world. And in the real world, the system performance seems to favor the secular.
You are looking at the scoreboard.
I'm looking at the scoreboard. Look at the stats. Secular democracies generally have better healthcare, better human rights records, more innovation, higher GDP per capita. Religious societies, particularly in the modern Muslim world, are often associated with stagnation, lower literacy rates in some areas, political instability, and authoritarianism. The argument here is that religion is a drag on the CPU of civilization. It is taking up processing power that should be used for science and development. If the code is so perfectly designed, why is the user experience so glitchy?
It is a valid observation of the current snapshot. If you look at the map today, it looks one way. But to judge a system, an operating system, you have to look at its entire runtime, not just the last crash log.
You want to do a historical debug.
I do. Because if the claim is that Islam inherently prevents progress, if the claim is that the code itself is the virus, then you have to explain the Golden Age.
The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom.
Yes. Let's transport ourselves back to 9th century Baghdad. or 10th century Cordoba. This wasn't a time of religious darkness. It was the brightest intellectual light on the planet. While London and Paris were mud streets, Baghdad was a metropolis of paved roads, streetlights, and massive hospitals.
Set the scene for us. What does the House of Wisdom actually sound like?
Imagine the sound of the desert wind fusing with the scratching of thousands of pens on parchment. You have scholars from every background, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Sabians, all gathering to translate and expand upon the knowledge of the world. Aristotle, Plato, Galen. They weren't burning books, they were saving them. And this wasn't a secular project. It was a project explicitly driven by the Quranic mandate.
Who are the heavy hitters here? Give me some names.
Well, you have Al-Khwarizmi,
The math guy.
the father of algebra, Al-Jabr, and his name, Al-Khwarizmi, literally gives us the word algorithm. The very thing that runs our entire digital lives, Google, social media, the stock market, it is all based on the work of a devout Muslim scholar in 9th century Baghdad.
That is a direct line to today.
Then you have Al-Haytham, the father of optics. He laid the groundwork for the camera and the scientific method itself. He was the first to rigorously test hypotheses with actual experimentation. You have Al-Zarawi in medicine, inventing surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, catgut sutures that are still incredibly similar to what surgeons use today.
Okay, but here is the skeptical pushback. Did they do this because of Islam or in spite of it? Were they just smart guys who happen to be Muslim? Maybe they were closet secularists.
That is the crucial question, and Ahmed argues they did it specifically because of the code. Look at the very first word of the Quran revealed to the Prophet.
Read.
Iqra, read. Chapter 96, verse 1. Not pray, not obey, not submit.
Her.
Read. And the Quran constantly refers to the book of the universe. These scientists saw zero division between studying the law of gravity and studying the law of God. To them, they were just studying the exact same author.
So understanding how light refracts was a form of theology.
Absolutely. Al-Haytham wasn't trying to disprove God by understanding light. He was trying to see how God's creation actually worked. It was an act of worship. The mosque and the laboratory were not enemies at all. They were neighbors.
So if the code drove the golden age, what happened? Why the lag now?
The rationalist argument is that the current lag in some Muslim societies is a bug, not a feature. It is a deviation from the code. If the code says read and explore the horizons, and the users literally stop reading and exploring, that is user error, not a system failure.
They stopped running the update.
Essentially. The source material argues that the holistic design, the good life, mentioned in chapter 16, verse 97, promises a balance of spiritual and material success. When that balance is lost, when you have spirit without science, or science without spirit, civilization lags or collapses.
User error. That is a very convenient way to explain away a lot of history, though, which brings us to the elephant in the room, the glitch that feels like a virus. Violence.
The most serious accusation.
It is. You cannot talk about religion without talking about the bloody ledger. The Crusades, the Inquisitions, and yes, modern terrorism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. The argument is simple. Religion breeds violence because it creates an ultimate us versus them. If God is on my side, then you are not just wrong, you are evil. And removing evil is a holy act.
It's the virus accusation.
Yeah.
That religion is a pathogen that infects the mind and just causes raw aggression.
Right. And how does the rationalist defend against that? Because user error feels a bit hollow when the body count is this high.
We have to do a code inspection. We have to look at the absolute kernel of the text. Does the text actually command this? Or is it political malware disguised as religion?
Okay, show me the kernel.
Chapter 2, verse 256. There is no compulsion in religion.
No compulsion, meaning you cannot force someone to convert.
It means faith by force is technically invalid. In the Quranic framework, belief is an act of the heart. You cannot force a heart to submit. If you hold a sword to someone's throat and they say, I believe, it doesn't count. God does not accept it. It is a null transaction.
So coercive religion is a violation of the system design.
It entirely voids the warranty. If you force it, you have broken the fundamental rule of the relationship between man and God.
But history is full of coercion.
That is the political layer. Kings and caliphs and crusaders using religion as a veneer for land and power. But look at the sanctity of life algorithm in chapter 5, verse 32. This is one of the most powerful lines in the book, and it's often quoted by politicians. But let's really look at what it says. To slay one soul unjustly is to slay all of mankind. And to save one life is to save all of mankind.
That is a staggering metric. One life equals all of humanity.
It creates an infinite value for a single human life. If you really run that code, terrorism becomes conceptually impossible. Terrorism relies on the idea that innocent lives are expendable for a greater cause. It relies on the utilitarian math that killing 50 innocents is worth it to send a message. The Quranic code says there is no greater cause than the sanctity of that single life, unless justice is legally demanded for a severe crime. The math just does not work for the terrorist.
What about the political structure, though? You mentioned the U.S. versus them binary. That seems baked into monotheism.
Let's look at the Constitution of Medina.
What is that?
This was a social contract drawn up by the Prophet Muhammad when he moved to Medina. It is arguably the first written constitution in human history. And it wasn't a theocratic dictatorship where everyone had to be Muslim or die. It was a deeply pluralistic society.
Pluralistic.
Yes. It included Jews, Christians, Muslims, and pagans. They signed a treaty of mutual defense. They had religious autonomy. The Jews were considered one community with the believers. They fought together against external threats.
So it was an early form of a federal system.
In a way, yes. It acknowledged that different communities had different faiths, but they shared a civil society. They were neighbors. The expert argument here is that the violence we see is almost always a result of abandoning these core algorithms. No compulsion and sanctity of life in favor of raw political tribalism.
Okay, user error again. I see the pattern. But let's look at a specific group of users who have historically had very limited rights. Women.
The patriarchal patch.
Yeah. This is a massive friction point. The critique is standard, and frankly, it is powerful. Religion is accused of oppressing women. We see it in the Manus Mirati, we see it in parts of the Bible, silence in churches, and yes, critics see it in the Quran. The idea that a woman's testimony is worth half a man's, that she inherits less, that she is essentially a minor under guardianship. How do you square sovereign intelligence with second-class citizenship?
This is a critical area to unpack because the user interface, what we see in some cultures today, often looks vastly different from the source code. The rationalist defense here is that the Quran was actually a radical reform package for its time.
Contextualize that for us. 7th century Arabia.
We are talking about a society where female infanticide was common. Newborn girls were buried alive in the sand because they were seen as a financial liability and a source of shame. Women were property. They were inherited along with the estate. If your father died, his wives could literally be passed on to the sons.
Grim. That is a horrific baseline.
Extremely. Then the Quran drops. And suddenly, infanticide is condemned as a horrific crime. But more than that, women are granted ownership of property. Chapter 4, verse 32, specifically states that women have a right to what they earn. This was revolutionary. In many parts of Europe, women didn't have full property rights until the late 19th century. The Quran established this in the 7th century.
Okay, property is one thing. What about marriage?
Chapter 30, verse 21 defines marriage not by ownership, but by tranquility, affection, and mercy. It is a partnership model.
But we have to address the controversy, the math, the critique that in inheritance, a sister gets half of what a brother gets. That sounds like the textbook definition of inequality.
It does, if you look at the numbers in a vacuum. But let's look at the overall system architecture. In Islamic law, the male is financially responsible for the entire family. His wife, his children, his parents, and his unwed sisters. His money is community money. The woman has zero financial obligation to the family. Her money is her money. She can be a millionaire, and her husband is still obligated to pay for the groceries.
So he gets more because his overhead is higher.
Exactly. It is equity based on responsibility, not arbitrary value. If he takes double but has to spend it all on the family and she takes half but keeps it all, she often ends up with more disposable income.
Okay, that is the money. But the witness issue, that 2 women are needed to replace 1 man in a contract, that feels like a direct attack on intelligence.
The critique is usually based on Chapter 2, verse 282, which is regarding financial contracts. The context there was a society where women were rarely involved in complex debt transactions. It was about ensuring accuracy in a specific area. But there's another set of laws regarding adultery and slander in Chapter 24 that completely flips this inequality argument on its head.
How so?
This is the witness controversy regarding the accusation of adultery. To accuse a woman of adultery, which obviously destroys her reputation and her life, the Quran demands 4 eyewitnesses to the actual physical act.
4? That seems impossible.
That is the point. It is designed to be nearly impossible to prove publicly in order to protect privacy and reputation. But here's the nuance. If a man accuses his wife and he doesn't have 4 witnesses, what happens?
In a traditional patriarchal society, she is probably in big trouble. Her word against his.
In the Quranic code, we have the concept of the oath, the Olanikin. This is chapter 24, verses 6 through 9. If the husband swears 4 times that he is telling the truth, he initiates the legal process.
Yeah.
But the wife can override his accusation.
Wait, she can overwrite it.
Yes. If she swears 4 times that he is lying, her testimony completely cancels his out. She's not punished. Her word creates a legal shield that the man cannot penetrate, regardless of his status in society.
That is fascinating. So in that specific, incredibly high-stakes scenario, her testimony has the power to neutralize his entirely.
Exactly. It was a system designed to protect women from social destruction and slander, which was a weapon constantly used against them. It wasn't designed to silence them, it was designed to give them a legal voice that could stand firm against a patriarchal accusation.
So, the argument is that the inequality in financial contracts is about familiarity with business practices of that era, but when dignity and life are on the line, the playing field levels out.
Or even tilts heavily in her favor regarding protection. It is about the specific function of the code in different modules of life.
All right, let's shift gears from the legal back to the spiritual. Let's talk about the user experience. Prayer.
The connectivity.
The empiricist view on prayer is pretty harsh. It is a placebo. It is validation by hindsight. If I pray for a job and I get it, I say God answered. If I don't get it, I say God has a better plan. It is unfalsifiable. And more importantly, it is the action versus idol argument. Engineers build bridges, prayers do not. When the earthquake hits, send doctors, not priests. Why waste time talking to the sky?
This is a classic false dichotomy. It assumes you have to choose between action and prayer. The Quran utterly rejects the idea of action or prayer. It demands action and reliance.
But isn't reliance inherently passive? Like, Jesus, take the wheel.
Not in this framework. This is the concept of tawakkul. It is dynamic trust. Look at chapter 53, verse 39. Man has not but what he strives for. In chapter 13, verse 11, God does not change a people's condition until they change themselves.
So you have to do the work first.
There is a famous anecdote from the prophet's tradition that sums this up perfectly. A Bedouin man asked the prophet, "Should I tie my camel and trust in Allah, or should I leave her untied and trust in Allah?"
And the answer,
Tie her and trust.
tie your camel. I like that a lot. It is highly practical.
It is the causal law. You must utilize the laws of causality, medicine, engineering, seatbelts as an act of worship. Using the brain God gave you is part of trusting God. You don't verify your brakes before you drive. You aren't trusting God. You are just being negligent.
So prayer isn't a vending machine. Insert coin, get miracle.
No. J.R. Ahmed describes prayer, salah, and dua not as a magic spell, but as an alignment of the will. It is a dialogue with the divine, as mentioned in 2.186. It is about checking in with the sovereign intelligence to ensure your actions are actually aligned with the moral code. You build the bridge, that is action, while praying that the bridge serves the people and you don't succumb to corruption in the construction that is spirituality.
So it is the software update that keeps the hardware running ethically.
That is a wonderful way to put it. It calibrates the intention.
But who gets this software? This brings us to the network coverage issue, the lottery of birth.
Ah, yes, geography.
This is one of the strongest arguments for atheism, or at least agnosticism. If I am born in Rio, I am likely Christian. If I am born in Riyadh, I am Muslim. If I am born in Mumbai, I am Hindu. Faith seems to be purely a result of where your mother happened to be when she gave birth. It is cultural indoctrination, not universal truth. If it was the truth with a capital T, wouldn't it be everywhere?
It certainly looks that way on the surface. But the Quranic response is to distinguish between the cultural package and the universal signal.
Distinguish them for me.
The Quran argues that the core signal, monotheism, accountability, doing good, is universal. Chapter 16, verse 36, states that messengers were sent to every nation.
Every nation.
Every single nation. And they spoke in the language of their people. The core message, monotheism, unity, accountability, was always the same. The source code was identical. But the cultural packaging, the language, the specific rituals, those differed.
So the argument is that the sheer diversity of religion is actually just different localized versions of the exact same original update.
The Quran claims to be the factory reset. It acknowledges that over time, those local versions got corrupted. People started worshiping the messengers instead of the sender, or adding statues or changing the laws. The Quran in chapter 21, verse 92 says, "This nation of yours is one nation."
One nation.
It argues that it is stripping away the bloatware of cultural religion to get back to the fitra. So, while you might be born in a specific culture, The Quran claims that your internal hardware recognizes the truth of monotheism regardless of your zip code. It transcends the geography. It is arguing that if you strip away the cultural paint, the engine underneath is exactly the same.
Okay, we are coming to the final stretch here.
Yeah,
And we have to address the core operating system of the skeptic. Evidence.
the evidence check.
Science demands proof. If I say I can fly, you say, show me. If I say E equals mc squared, you can test it. Religion demands blind faith. Just believe. The argument is that faith without evidence is irresponsible. It is intellectual laziness.
And here is where I get to drop the biggest surprise of the deep dive. The Quran agrees with you.
It agrees.
It agrees that blind faith is irresponsible. In fact, it explicitly condemns people who just follow their forefathers blindly. The Quran offers what we might call a falsification test.
Yes.
Chapter 2, verse 23. If you're in doubt about what we have sent down, then produce a chapter like it.
The literary challenge.
It is an intellectual challenge. But beyond that, the Quran constantly asks, do you not reason? Do you not reflect? Do you not think? It does not say, just shut up and believe.
It demands active processing.
And it categorizes evidence into three distinct types. First, historical. Look at the ruins of past civilizations, chapter 30, verse 9. Go see what happened to the tyrants. Learn from the data set of history. Second, empirical. Look at the biology of the seed, chapter 6, verse 99. Look at the structure of the cosmos. And third, experiential. Look within your own conscience, chapter 51, verse 20.
So it is a complete triangulation of data, history, nature, and self.
Exactly. Ahmed argues that it is not blind faith believing without seeing. It is reasoned conviction believing because you have actually seen the signs.
Reasoned conviction. That is a vastly different interface than blind faith.
It is. It is belief as a conclusion, not just a starting point.
Okay, let's unpack this whole journey we've been on. We started with the idea that religion is just old, dusty code, a survival mechanism for scared people who didn't understand why the lightning was striking.
And we've moved through the code inspection. We have seen that the Quran frames the lightning not as a monster, but as a sign of a highly sophisticated system. We have seen that it anchors morality in something sturdier than shifting social trends, preventing the untwisting of the thread.
We have looked at the Golden Age as proof that the code can run incredibly high-level scientific processes. We have looked at the glitch of violence and distinguished it from the no-compulsion algorithm.
We have seen the reform package for women's rights, giving legal shields where there were absolutely none. We've seen the dynamic trust of prayer tying your camel and the universal signal that totally transcends geography.
So what does this all mean for the listener, for you, the learner?
It means that the ghost in the code isn't a bug. It is the designer. The journey from the lightning bolt gods to sovereign intelligence is the exact journey the Quran invites you to take. It is not an invitation to turn off your brain. It is an invitation to turn it on fully.
It is a dialogue.
Yes, a dialogue with the divine.
And here is where it gets really interesting for you, listening right now. If the Quran is right, if the signs are in the horizons and within yourself, then the evidence isn't locked in a library somewhere. It is in the sky you look at, and it is in the consciousness you are using to listen to this very conversation.
Which means the only variable left in the equation is you.
It's not a monologue from the sky. It is waiting for a receiver.
And that receiver is your intellect in your heart.
I'll leave you with this final thought. If the universe really is a book and science is just the act of reading it, what happens when you finally realize who wrote it? Are you just reading the code or are you ready to run it? That is a lot to process, but that is why we do this. Thanks for diving deep with us.
Always a pleasure to explore the system.
We'll see you on the next one. Keep thinking.